Now, tobacco is a labor intensive crop, all right? So you figure out that this is going to grow and this is going to make a lot of money, but we need people to work. We need laborers. We need a source of labor. And so there are two sources of labor in colonial Virginia. The first of these being indentured servants. These were poor Europeans who agreed to a fixed term of forced labor in return for their passage across the Atlantic. Now, why are they called indentured servants? Good question. That is because an indenture was a type of contract. Both sides get a copy. It's got a jagged edge that looks like somebody bit it, rather than cut it with scissors or something like that. So you cut it along this jagged edge, and you know that the contract's real when the two identical parts are put together with the identical indenture. And in a lot of cases, there would actually be 3 copies of the contract, and one would be kept at the courthouse. So that's why it's called an indenture, because it's a type of contract between two individuals or groups. Now, the other part of Virginia's labor force would have been African slaves. Now, this is something that was gradual. At the very beginning, there were more indentured servants than African slaves. In fact, at the very beginning, there were 0 African slaves. And slavery kind of gradually became institutionalized in colonial Virginia until finally it was decided that slaves were the property of their masters for life. But it wasn't until 1619 that 20 African slaves arrived in Virginia, and it really was kind of, all right, well, what do we do with them? Because at first, slaves were actually treated like indentured servants. And, this is something that probably goes beyond a survey level course, but one day I may do a lecture about what, is about the evolution of slavery as an institution in Virginia in the 17th century. But in 1619, the first slaves arrived. Now, by 1670, you see this piece of art here that shows us all of these slaves working here in Virginia, cultivating tobacco, it looks like. And by this time, by the last quarter of the 17th century, African slaves had become the dominant labor force in Virginia. Before that, it was not the case. Indentured servitude was much more common. Now, as we look at this graph, we can see what happened to slavery in Virginia during the 17th century. At the very beginning, there were none. In 1619, you've got 20 of them. By 1650, there were only about 300 African slaves in Virginia at that time. And then you see in the second half of the century, and especially in the last quarter of the 17th century, you see the numbers skyrocket from being only about 300 in 1650 to about 10,000 in 1700. Now, one of the turning points of this, now we have to ask ourselves, why did slavery replace indentured servitude as the primary labor force? Well, once indentured servants finished their term of indenture, they would get land and they would move out into the countryside. This land typically wasn't as good as the tidewater land closer to the coast. And also, this land was more remote, it was more vulnerable to Indian attacks and things of that nature. And so in 1676, what we see is Bacon's Rebellion, which was a revolt of frontier settlers versus tidewater planters, the planters being these very wealthy landowners. And what you see happening here is that these indentured servants, after they're done working, they form, a potential angry mob. And there were also black men who participated in Bacon's Rebellion. And slavery as a labor force was found more convenient by these planters because the slaves don't move out onto the frontier and become independent and rowdy when their term of indenture is done. Instead, they stay on the plantation, their children are property, so on and so forth. But Bacon's Rebellion is sometimes looked at as a turning point in the history of the Virginia colony when you look at the greater reliance on slave labor rather than a reliance on indentured servitude. And this brings us back to the Powhatan Indians. I told you we'd come back to that. And we remember this story about John Smith completely helpless at the hands of these Powhatan Indians, of these Jamestown colonists starving and eating each other and being desperate and dependent on these Indians. Well, that didn't last very long. Once John Rolfe introduced the cultivation of this tobacco, they started growing this like crazy, all right? They start planting it. Tobacco exhausts the soil. You have to plant it for a few seasons, then you move in. And the English had an approach to dealing with the Indians that was really unlike any other colonial power. While the Spanish wanted the Indians to follow them, to do what they told them. And the French and the Dutch were more, hey, lead us to money and trade and all of that kind of stuff. The English really developed this agricultural system that did not require them to rely on the Indians at all. And really the interest here is get out of the way. We're trying to plant crops and all you're doing is running around in the forest or whatever it is you're doing in the viewpoint of these English colonists. And so with that, the Powhatan Indians became resentful, and as these English colonists multiplied and they kept moving inward and inward, well, there was a reaction of this, and that reaction came in the form of the 1622 Indian Massacre, in which 347 English settlers were killed, and I'm going to go over the list of the dead in a follow-up video. Got a real awesome story. It's going to blow your mind. But 347, that was about a quarter of all of the colonists. There were only about 1,300 people in the Virginia colony at that time. So this is a fourth of them gone. And all in one fell swoop. Now you can see on this engraving here that it was very sudden. The English really had no idea where this was coming from. Now the other thing here is anytime we look at any kind of visual source, we have to ask who made this engraving, the point of view, the context, audience, and purpose. Now, as far as the point of view, I think we can quickly come to the conclusion that the point of view here is English. After all, we can see that they're all of these helpless, disarmed people, and you see here at the very center, you see that there is an Indian about to kill a woman and a child. You see that same scene repeating itself here, the killing of women and children. Now, this happened. Women and children were certainly killed, but you can see here that this is clearly sympathetic to the English and showing the English as victims of this massacre. Now, in the aftermath of this massacre, the Virginia Company's charter was revoked in 1624, and Virginia would be governed as a royal colony by the Crown until it declared independence in 1776. And remember that ultimately the Crown is in charge of all of the colonies and can give and take as it pleases, and this is kind of foreshadowing what will happen to colonies such as Massachusetts leading up to the American Revolution with the Intolerable Act. But with that, that's the end of this particular lecture. I'm about to tell a story in a follow-up that, like I said, pretty mind-blowing for me and pretty personal. But that's the end of this lecture, and if you like what you saw here, remember to subscribe, TomRichey.net, social media, and all of that other good stuff. It's always a pleasure.